All right, our first pair of speakers are a cooperative international team who will be speaking about the unraveling material world of enslaved laborers in colonial Jamaica. It's a team effort. We have a pair of people here. Jillian Galle, who for the past 10 years has directed the Digital Archaeological Archive of Comparative Slavery, which has a lot of online information. DAX is the acronym, so if you're interested in that, there's a lot of information there. And the DAX project is a research project based at Monticello that provides scholars and the public access to archaeological and historical data from domestic sites of slavery throughout the early and modern Atlantic world. Her PhD is in anthropology, and she's an archaeologist by training, as you'll see from her paper. Her research focuses on enslaved women and men's participation in the consumer revolution in the Chesapeake and the Caribbean. Her collaborator is Suzanne Francis Brown, who is the curator of the museum at the University of the West Indies at Mona, and works in Archives Palace, the great house on the campus, sorry, the brand new museum structure at the University of the West Indies in Jamaica. She has multiple interests, including the Gibraltar camp in Jamaica, and this was a World War II evacuee and refugee camp that became the basis for where the campus would be at the University of the West Indies, and was also the subject of her PhD work. Her multi-layered history of the founding site is the subject of her 2004 book called Mona, Past and Present, The Plantation Period on the Mona Site, which is a fabulous illustrated book if you can get a hold of that. And then our second speaker, Miguel Pena, is speaking on refining sugar, the re-representation of sugar as Barbadian heritage, and he works as the assistant curator of history at the Barbados Museum and Historical Society, a position which he has held for the past 2 years. He has an MA in Heritage Tourism from the University of Wales, has published several articles, including Our American Lady, the story of Lady Gilbert Carter in the Journal of the Barbados Museum and Historical Society Bulletin in 2009, and he points out that there are more recent issues of that publication available online too. So if you want to follow up on Barbados history, that's a fabulous museum and historical publication as well. Our third paper, fourth speaker, is Elizabeth Maddock Dillon, who is a professor of English at Northeastern University. She's the author of The Gender of Freedom and Fictions of Liberalism and the Literary Public Sphere, which came out in 2004 from Stanford University Press, and has a forthcoming book, New World Drama, The Performative Commons in the Atlantic World, 1649 to 1849, which will be coming out next year with Duke University Press. I'm going to try and keep people to time, but also when it comes time for questions, I'm going to ask you to come up here and ask your question into the microphone so that we don't have to keep repeating the questions. I realize that's a little bit daunting, but it'll give us a little bit more time for asking questions.
So good afternoon. I'm Suzanne Francis Brown, which makes us Jillian Galle. Jillian and I want to join in expressing our pleasure at the opportunity to visit Brown and to share with other scholars here through the kind hospitality of the JCB Library, whose very relevant resources the conference also showcases. This paper, Unraveling the Material World of Enslaved Laborers in Colonial Jamaica, represents a conversation and a collaboration that is ongoing and that draws on earlier work in our varied and various disciplines. In celebration of this conversation, I will begin with one of the illustrative cues to our discussion here, and then I'll hand over to Jillian to take you on through the rest. In a drawer in the Maps and Plans room at the National Library of Jamaica is an unsigned, undated plan. It shows in fine architectural detail the aqueduct, sugar mill, and boiling house of the Pepin estate in the parish of St. Andrew, Jamaica. The plan details much of the now crumbling mill, and its inscription offers insights into efforts to diversify the estate in anticipation of, or perhaps in the aftermath of, emancipation of the enslaved labor force in 1838. The inscription notes that the sugar mill has been removed from its current configuration and that, I quote, "It is desired to know the best way of attaching an horizontal hydrostatic press to the shaft and the additions necessary therefore. Also the best way of attaching 4 or 5 common mortars for pounding coconut pulp or other oil-producing substances, the intention being that the water wheel shank work a paper mill, a hydrostatic press, 4 or 5 mortars, and if necessary, a small 1-horse mill," unquote. On the one hand, this reads as an example of the largely unsuccessful efforts to diversify Jamaica's significantly sugar-based economies in the early to mid-19th century. More specifically, it exemplifies the change-oriented approaches of James Beckford Wildman, who held the Pena estate for 2 decades prior to emancipation, with intended and unintended consequences for the estate's laboring population, who lived in a sprawling village just north of the sugar mill. And you can see the houses there. The desire for a single mechanical device driven by water and perhaps a single horse that produced a range of products from diverse agricultural sources, paper, oils, pounded and ground substances, and even sugar, highlights the economic anxieties gripping 19th century Jamaica, anxieties that began in the late 1700s and that were nearing a fever pitch on the eve of emancipation. Solving the engineering puzzle of how to create that mill to save a sugar estate in decline is the task of another paper. Here we step back to explore how the drive towards agricultural diversification that spurred such engineering schemes affected the material lives of enslaved laborers living on sugar estates across Jamaica. A unique combination of sources, from archaeological data and contemporary plats to testimony from overseers, provide us all with a glimpse at the intertwined economics of local plantation management policies and enslaved labor activities within the island's internal markets.
So Suzanne and I began this exploration in 2008 when we met at the mill ruins on the southern edge of the Pepin slave village on the campus of the University of West Indies, Mona. I was starting the first of 4 excavation seasons at the Pepin and Mona slave villages and was broadly focused on understanding the consumer activities of enslaved people in the market economies of the Chesapeake and Caribbean. Suzanne had recently completed a book on the history of the Mona campus site, a history indelibly shaped by the 18th century sugar industry. Over the past 5 years, we've worked together on this issue from 2 sides, a fine-grained historical focus on a single plantation and a regional comparative framework for understanding the archaeological record of slave villages across the island. The remainder of this paper is the result, a detailed look at the Pepin estate's attempts to diversify its economic focus, that attempt's impact on the material world of Pepin's enslaved laborers, and how their consumption patterns fit within island-wide trends apparent in the archaeological record. In order to understand the intimate relationship between agricultural diversification and enslaved participation in the market economy, we must first begin with an understanding of the consumer revolution, a phenomenon that social and economic historians consider among the most significant developments in the history of the early modern Atlantic world. Beginning in the 17th century, the availability and importance of material culture at all scales, from houses such as this one in central Jamaica to ceramic wares, they accelerated at a startling pace. By the 1750s, economic changes in the English-speaking Atlantic world made some degree of non-essential consumption viable for almost everybody, including enslaved people. Throughout the Caribbean, enslaved laborers shopped in markets and stores, purchasing tools, imported and locally produced ceramic wares, fabric, buttons, buckles, and food, among many other documented items. They purchased these items using money they earned or through informal bartering systems. Vegetables and fruit, eggs and livestock, and handcrafted brooms and ceramics were just some of the items sold and traded by enslaved people in Jamaica. Despite legislative attempts to control and curtail market activities during the last quarter of the 18th century, enslaved participation in Jamaica's Sunday markets was legal. Some 18th century estimates suggest that slaves held up to a fifth of the island's silver, a staggering amount that clearly made white merchants and planters nervous. Slaves, as producers, marketers, higglers, and customers, drove local economies and were an essential component of both rural and urban markets. Now, reading the literature on Jamaican markets might lead one to conclude that nearly all slaves had similar purchasing power. The material record of slaves, as evidenced in archaeological assemblages from slave village sites on the north and south coasts of Jamaica, indicate otherwise. For example, abundance indices that track the consumption of expensive imported ceramics, such as porcelains, delft, and creamwares. And I'm just going to say as an aside, all the material culture going forward are from archaeological sites on the island of Jamaica. From 21 slave site occupations demonstrate a wide range of variability in the discard of these wares. And this is the first of several plots. This is a multiple regression that looks at the discard of ceramic, those refined ceramics on sites in Jamaica, the 21 sites. Each diamond here is a site, okay, is a single site. And this red line, it should be the average level of consumption for a site at a given point in time. And I'm not going to get into the math behind this, but I'm happy to afterwards or in the question and answer session. I've argued elsewhere, and the same is true for buttons. So we see a lot of variability in these sites, right? Some are higher consumers, others are not able to, are not acquiring any metal buttons in this case. The same holds true for fashionable and costly metal buttons. I've argued elsewhere that the material difference between slaves living on sugar plantations and those on coffee plantations was the result of significant differences in plantation labor demands. Sugar's relentless gang-based labor system brutalized enslaved people. Malnutrition, injury, and disease prevented natural population increase. Death was pervasive among sugar laborers. The exceptional physical toll sustained by female slaves on sugar plantations is evidenced in negative birth rates of negative 12.4 per year in the early 19th century compared to those on coffee plantations, which were about 1 to 2 positive increase. Montpelier Plantation in St. James Parish, which imported over 25 enslaved Africans a year for each of the 15 years preceding the abolition of slavery, in attempts to sustain its slave population, was not by any means exceptional. And just very quickly, these are numbers taken from Barry Higman, so you can visualize this. This is the rate of natural increase, which plummets in the first 3 decades of the 19th century, and death rates for men and for women, which slowly rise throughout the early 19th century. And this is, he doesn't split it out by coffee plantations, but this gives you general trends across Jamaica at that time. In contrast, coffee's seasonal, task-based labor system required slaves to work multiple jobs at varying levels of intensity throughout the year. The result was the development of a corps of slaves on coffee plantations that possessed non-agricultural skills. These individuals frequently had greater flexibility within their assigned tasks and were often hired out during lulls in the agricultural cycle. Enslaved men especially reaped the benefits of hiring out in the form of mobility that increased knowledge of the landscapes outside their home plantations and expanded their social and economic contacts. And as I've also argued elsewhere, such mobility and connections were essential for establishing reliable relationships with other slaves for the forms of collective action such as running away and rebellion. Finally, as one would expect, coffee plantations had significantly lower mortality than significantly lower mortality than sugar plantations. So what connects gang-based sugar and task-based coffee production with consumer behavior among enslaved people? Provision grounds, which we've been hearing a lot about all of this, so we're trying to bring it all together here. The answer we suggest is the Jamaican planters' provisioning system. With the exception, and here are just 2 estates. This is the Stuart Castle, here's the village, here's the Great House, here are the provision grounds. in very mountainous marginal land. Here's another plat of the Pepin village, another view of it. Their provision grounds are located over here. With the exception of a single parish, plantation owners in Jamaica required their slaves to produce the vast majority of their own food. As we have heard over the past 2 days, the system originally advocated in Brazil put tremendous stress on enslaved individuals and families. Survival depended on a slave's ability to cultivate the ground at the end of a debilitating shift in the cane fields or sugar factory. Those laboring on coffee plantations immediately had an advantage over sugar laborers. They were simply in better physical condition, and their seasonal task-based labor likely gave them additional time to work their grounds. The provision of ground system also put the ability of one to feed oneself at the mercy of unpredictable and often violent weather. Despite these conditions, enslaved people on both coffee and sugar estates produced excess provision grounds. Successful crop production that exceeded family needs allowed for market acquisition of non-essential household items, many of which are represented in the archaeological record. This record makes these benefits of laboring on non-sugar estates visible. Higher than average rates of fine imported ceramic wares and fashionable yet costly metal buttons are all significantly positively correlated with slave-dwelling sites at the Juan de Bolas coffee plantation in central Jamaica, where enslaved laborers consume greater quantities of certain fashionable goods than people enslaved on sugar plantations. And the yellow squares represent coffee plantations, the green dots represent slave site occupations on sugar. So I was just finishing a more detailed version of this research as I began field work at the Pepin Slave Village in collaboration with the University of West Indies Department of History and Archaeology. And at the same time, Suzanne was diving deeper into the records of J.B. Wildman's efforts to not only diversify Pepin, but to also provide more time off and education for his slaves. Although the accounts produce records indicated that Pepin produced sugar and rum on a more or less constant basis between 1768 and 1847, production levels were not consistent, as we see here. Quantity of and revenue from sugar-related products decreased dramatically beginning in the 19th century, and these same documents indicate that the money earned from the sale or lease of produce and goods, which ranged from grass and corn to old equipment and land and water rents, increased substantially beginning in 1810. Pepin was not alone in these diversification efforts. Factors over which Jamaican planters had little control, such as weather and disease, labor costs, and falling sugar prices, pushed many plantations towards some level of diversification by the early 19th century. Barry Higman has shown the sharp increase in pimento and ginger output between 1800 and 1834 as sugar and coffee production fell, with most of the increase occurring on previously monocrop sugar estates. He noted that estates in distress also exploited local resources, as we've heard today, tropical hardwoods, for example, and others like Pepin controlled water rights, which Wildman sold for a premium beginning in the mid-1820s. And this is a really fabulous map of the aqueduct system and water system through Pepin that he is selling rights to. For hundreds and hundreds of pounds. Livestock also played an important role in diversification at Pepin and elsewhere. In 1832, Wildman and one-time Wildman planting attorney William Taylor both gave evidence before a select committee of the English House of Representatives on the abolition of slavery. Taylor, who had been in charge of Pepin and 2 other Wildman estates for about a year from 1829, said of Pepin, "When I held it, it was a sugar estate, but the cultivation of sugar was gradually being discontinued and the rearing of cattle being introduced. Seville Estate and Stewart Castle, both on the north coast of Jamaica, also struggled with decreasing sugar returns in the early 19th century and turned to other products in an attempt to maintain revenue. Seville to pimento, coconut, and lime. Stewart Castle more towards cattle pen status." And here's a view of Stewart Castle, and thankfully the light is blocking out the goats, which are not cattle, but you can imagine cattle roaming all over Stewart Castle by about 1810. So by the early 19th century, many Jamaican planters were not simply diversifying. They were also assiduously weighing the costs and benefits of more effective labor management. In an effort to avert labor losses due to malnutrition and starvation, especially in the context of supply stoppages due to the American Revolutionary War, efforts to import more food trees into Jamaica increased. The practice of allowing enslaved people one day each fortnight out of crop, exclusive of Sundays for their own cultivation, was made compulsory in 1792. Wild men also had more progressive goals for Pepin's enslaved population than simply 26 days off a year. In evidence to the 1832 Select Committee, William Taylor stated, on Mr. Wildman's estates, the slaves had privileges that were very peculiar. They had, for the most part, in addition to the 26 weekdays allowed by law during the year, every Saturday as it came round out of crop, and in crop every second Saturday, and every alternate week in crop the half of a Saturday. His object was to give them a full share of rest, sleep, and to preserve Sunday, at least as far as he could. Taylor also said that enslaved persons at Pepin wholly maintained themselves by provisions raised on land allocated for their use. He said that they chiefly grew yams, plantains, cocoa, potatoes, and received an annual allowance of clothing. Taylor's testimony also confirmed that in addition to providing food for survival, provision grounds were a critical and most often the only economic resource for enslaved people, with the exception of those with special skills they could use to their benefit in any spare time. He said that based on his experience, many enslaved persons purchased clothes and household items better than anything provisioned, and that some had a keen relish for the comforts of life. So as Suzanne was digging through the archives and I was digging in the dirt, Suzanne raised a critical question. What happens to the material world of slaves on sugar plantations that are diversifying but still heavily reliant on sugar production? Is there even a marginal increase in the quality and abundance of material goods for slaves living on sugar plantations that were struggling to diversify in the face of declining sugar prices and increasing labor costs? Archaeology is perfectly poised to provide some answers. Since 2000, the Digital Archaeological Archive of Comparative Slavery, based at Monticello, has provided scholars and the public access to detailed data from over 50 excavated sites of slavery in the Chesapeake, Carolinas, and the Caribbean. Over 160,000 artifacts from 21 slave sites located across 7 plantations in Jamaica allow us to closely track the complex interrelationship of estate economics, environmental factors, and the extent and shape of enslaved labor participation in island markets. One critically important aspect about archaeological data is that it can tell time. We have known manufacturing dates on ceramics, and they allow us to precisely track slave consumption patterns over time. DAX not only contains data from domestic sites dating between 1760 and 1860, but it also represents sugar monoculture, coffee, and what we'll call diversifying sugar estates, like Pepin, Seville, and Stewart Castle, which we have all mentioned. As noted earlier, the archaeological record from these sites includes a wide range of both costly, refined, and inexpensive utilitarian ceramics, such as this one. Wine bottles, leaded glass, tools, utensils, and adornment items such as buckles, beads, buttons. And especially, this is what our field laboratories look like on any given day. This is during the Stewart Castle field work. This is during the Pepin field work. And an especially mind-boggling find that I couldn't resist, I had to put it in here, is a pair of sugar nippers found from a slave village at Stewart Castle, far from their overseers, the works, and the main house. So while it's hard to deny the evocative appeal, right, of these individual artifacts, such as these, the real power of archaeological data lie in their patterning. Earlier I showed trends demonstrating that a significant positive correlation between the discard of high-style, costly, non-provisioned ceramics and buttons with slaves living on coffee plantations. Since that research, the inclusion of data from excavations at Pepin, Mona, and Stewart Castle allow us to track whether slaves living on diversifying sugar estates had greater market access and purchasing power compared to those living on pure sugar monoculture sites. So statistics allow us to code datable occupation phases by category: coffee, sugar, monocultural sugar, and diversifying sugar. And so here we have a multiple regression. The browns are coffee, the blues are diversifying sugar, the greens are pure monoculture sugar. And as you can see, the p-value is statistically significant, and the consumption of costly imported refined ceramics is positively correlated with residents on both diversifying sugar and coffee. Even more interesting, costly decoration for any given time period, again, strongly positively correlated with diversifying sugar here in blue. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to sort of zip through this quickly. Interestingly enough, even inexpensive locally produced coarse earthenwares can tell us a lot about how slaves were participating in the market. Locally produced coarse earthenwares known as yabas or Afro-Caribbean wares tell us much about how diversification impacted a slave's ability to produce excess ground provisions that could be parlayed into consumer goods. Between 1760 and 1860, discard of locally produced coarse earthenwares fell in relationship to refined coarse earthenwares. And here, these are each individual sites. These are Pepin sites. These are Seville sites. Stuart Castle sites. Montpelier sites are down here. More intriguingly, coarse earthenware vessel forms changed during this period, shifting from thinner potted tablewares and cookwares to thicker walled, unglazed vessels likely used for food storage. And here we see the difference between the thin walled and the thick walled storage vessels. Presumably, the thinner vessels were being replaced by European and Asian imports, while the need for storage vessels increased as ground provision production and the need for food and liquid storage increased. These data indicate that enslaved people living on diversifying sugar estates such as Pepin and Seville were taking advantage of the increased provision ground access and days off, which allowed for the cultivation of produce and creation of goods that could be sold or exchanged in markets. They then reinvested some funds into costly, non-essential last page, I promise. Perishable goods. Let's go. Finally, a quick look at the discard of glass African trade beads, objects that likely came on the bodies of slaves over to Jamaica, and that are often interpreted as signs of African cultural and religious traditions. And they demonstrate precisely the exact opposite trends on these sites. Their use and discard are not correlated with diversifying sugar or coffee occupations. We see here coffee sites down here. These sites, rather, we see the highest rates of discard from Montpelier Estate, which, if you recall, had exceptionally high importation rates of enslaved Africans for nearly 2 decades preceding the abolition of the slave trade. These sites also had exceptionally low discard of imported non-essential goods. Together, the historical record and archaeological patterns suggest ruthless work conditions at Montpelier that resulted in unstable, culturally diverse, and resource-stressed environment. Discovering, analyzing, and interpreting the material remains of enslaved households is essential to understanding how people responded to local and regional conditions. While the provision ground system introduced uncertainty into the lives of some, for those living on diversifying sugar and coffee estates, it allowed a modicum of freedom and agency. Participating in markets not only allowed people to make practical and aesthetic choices based on money they had earned, but perhaps more importantly, provided opportunities for making local and regional connections with other enslaved laborers, as well as free Creole and white merchants. There are many new and exciting directions embedded in these data that we presented today, from looking at the factors influencing consumption among households on the same plantation to comparisons with other sites of slavery in different regions of the Atlantic world. Suzanne and I will continue to interweave objects and texts, and we hope that some of you will be inspired to do so as well. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Miguel Pena. I'm the Assistant Curator of History at the Barbados Museum, and I'd like to say a warm thank you to the organizers of this conference, John Carter Brown Library, for affording me the opportunity to come here and to present this little presentation. Refining Sugar, the Re-Representation of Sugar as Barbadian Heritage by the Barbados Museum and Historical Society. brief outline of my presentation. Sugar in Barbados, a brief summary. The heritage of sugar is ubiquitous. Interpreting and reinterpreting sugar at the Barbados Museum, which I will refer to as the BMHS, both in the pre- and post-independence eras. How sugar is represented in our galleries, our exhibitions, our programmatic activities, our collaborations, and what's missing from sugar's interpretation, and a conclusion. Right, so I'm not going to belabor the point too much, but every sugar's origin story follows as such in Barbados. Writers and scholars of Barbadian history, such as Richard Ligon, True and Exact Account of the History of Barbados, Vincent Harlow, A History of Barbados, 1625 to 85, Richard Dunn, Sugar and Slaves, The Rise of the English Planter Class, 1624 to 17, and most recently Matthew Parker in his work, The Sugar Barons, Family, Corruption, Empire, and War, all present a very similar origin story of sugar in Barbados, which is as follows. Sugar is introduced in the late 1630s by Amerindian people from Guyana who were either invited or compelled to go to Barbados and instruct the English as to the ways of tropical agriculture. Sugar, however, is not viewed at that time as being a viable commodity. This is because Barbados is still deeply involved in cotton and tobacco production. However, at about the same time, economic and political issues start to impact cotton and tobacco production, namely competition from cotton and tobacco planters in the Chesapeake area in what would become the United States. Added to this dimension comes the Dutch loss of their Brazilian sugar empire, and we heard Klooster speak earlier about that, and there's another point that needs to be added. English settlers in Barbados are actually also going to Brazil. James Drax is going to Brazil, learning the sugar culture, and coming back to Barbados. So there's also some sugar input there by the English. The heritage of Barbados is everywhere, both within the tangible as well as the intangible expressions. Sugar is everywhere within the tangible expressions of Barbadian heritage, seen within plantation great houses, historic archaeological sites, the appearance of the island's landscape, mill walls, fortifications, warehouses. It's even on our coat of arms and on the 25-cent piece. If you look, the image in the middle is the coat of arms. There is a hand on top of a helmet holding two crossed pieces of sugar cane. That's actually the Saltaire Cross. Barbados gets its independence on the 30th of November, which is St. Andrew's Day, by the way. The intangible evidence of sugar is also there. It appears in our folk songs, our calypsos, recipes, racial and class hierarchies, and also within the Crop Over festival. Of course, as it relates to intangible heritage, for instance, in our folk songs, there are songs like Cut the Sugar Cane Till It Bun Me Hand. That's a Barbadian folk song which describes laborers working on a sugarcane field. There's also Barbadian calypsos such as Mr. Harding Can't Burn. And Mr. Harding was an effigy that was made of trash. We had presentations yesterday about bagasse, and these effigies were made out of cane trash. They were dressed in a top hat and a coat, and then they were set on fire. They were supposed to represent hard times. Some people think they're supposed to represent planters. And of course, there are also other folk masquerade expressions. If you look in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, you're going to see what is known as the Mother Sallies. And the traditional Mother Sally is a male in drag, essentially, but he is being replaced now by female Mother Sallies. So it's pretty interesting stuff that's happening there. Presenting and representing sugar in Barbados. There are other cultural agents on the Barbadian landscape besides the Barbados Museum. There's also the Ministry of Tourism, which is promoting heritage as it relates to heritage tourism, the Ministry of Youth, Sports and Culture, as well as the Barbados National Trust. However, and this is my bias, I think the Barbados Museum probably gets the job done most cohesively, although it's not complete by any stretch of the imagination. Interpreting sugar at the BMHS pre-independence era. This image is taken in the late 1930s of many of the founders of the Barbados Museum and Historical Society. It's a pretty homogeneously white group, as you can see. And there's some pretty important characters there. This gentleman is Eustace Maxwell Shilstone, the founder of the Barbados Museum and Historical Society. And those of you who are interested, of course, in things such as science and sugar, There's also a fairly well-noted sugar technologist, Jack Saint, and that's him over here. Right, moving on. Interpreting sugar during the pre-independence era. So the Barbados Museum is Barbados's de facto national museum. We receive a subvention from government, but we are a private organization, so we're a fairly interesting hybrid. Our mandate is to collect, document, conserve evidence of Barbados's cultural, historical, and environmental heritage, and present this evidence for all of the society. Sugar features very prominently within the early exhibitions of the Barbados Museum. I'll just move on. During the 1930s, for instance, if you look in the minutes of the Barbados Museum, the council are approached by the Barbados Sugar Exporters Association, and they're essentially giving the Barbados Museum a fund to represent sugar within its exhibitions. Also at that time, the 6th Earl of Harwood, a man by the name of Henry George Lascelles, visits Barbados and also the Barbados Museum. Now, Lascelles is a very important name within the English Atlantic world, and especially in Barbados. They are big sugar planters in Barbados in the 17th century, and also they are obviously large slave owners. At the same time, we can see how the interpretation of sugar happens through a guidebook, which is produced. What to see at the BMHS, a popular guide to the exhibit. And it features the galleries. Right, so although there are no pictures of the galleries, I'm improvising here a bit. The galleries at that time in the 30s were labeled, or rather the cases where sugar was represented, M1 through to M4. And I've got an image there of some sugarcane segments, as well as a clay sugar mold, for those of you who've never really seen one in person. So basically, they look at the growing stages of sugarcane, the sugar molds, the production of syrup, and manufacturing. What's missing? Of course, the human story. There's nothing there about indentured servitude, nothing there about African slavery, and there's nothing there about the impact on the environment. So it's basically purely an economic story. This more or less persists right through into the 1950s and 60s. In the 1950s, however, the museum gets the Drax Gallery, which is opened in 1956 and commemorates the role of Colonel James Drax, who, as I said earlier, is a pioneer within sugar. Again, it doesn't really talk about slavery at all, and it really doesn't even talk about the pioneering or the early role that James Drax plays in Barbados. Again, the economic history is told, nothing about indentured servants, and then later the transatlantic slave trade and the shift to African labor. Reinterpreting sugar at the Barbados Museum, the post-independence era. And this picture really represents a paradigm shift in what's going on. I'm going to just quickly describe some of the people. You should recognize at least one person in this photograph, but I'll start with the lady in the white with the beige hat, who's talking to the lady that you all know. The lady in the white hat is the director of the Barbados Museum, Miss Alessandra Cummins, and she is still the director. And of course, that is Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, who visited the Barbados Museum October 1985, for the reopening of the reinterpreted galleries. Right. Reinterpreting sugar at the Barbados Museum, post-independence period. So up throughout the 1970s, late 1970s, the Barbados Museum's collections and interpretations remain overwhelmingly Eurocentric. And essentially, it's the story of the great man, quote unquote. So let me just pick up here. The stories, as I said, are omitted of Amerindians and indentured people, etc. The first step to addressing this, however, comes when the National Council on Libraries, Archives and Document Centers, NACOLADS, writes a report in 1980. The report recommends that government support for the Barbados Museum should be increased, its staff should be professionalized, and most importantly, that Barbados must create, and I quote, a national museum which must reflect the character as well as the nation's history and must be a center for community and cultural activities. And those are the quotes right there, more or less. Out of the NAOCLAD's reports comes the Museum Development Plan Committee, and that is essentially formed by the Minister of Culture at the time, Mr. Nigel Barrow, and it is chaired by Professor Sir Woodville Marshall, who is an eminent Barbadian historian as well as a UWI academic. The final report of the Museum Development Committee indicates by stealth how the Barbados Museum, the new interpretation, is going to tell the story by sort of a roundabout way, by referencing what is happening to a similar museum that's being built by the National Trust, which tells the story of Barbados's sugar heritage. So the museum says that's fine, but we are telling its social history. We're telling the social history of sugar, and they lay claim to that. The galleries of the Barbados Museum. And these are the galleries that came about after that reinterpretation, and it was reopened in 1985. So I'll just be very brief here. You're seeing some images. This next to me, to my immediate left, that's the Jubilee Gallery, which speaks to the social history of Barbados in general. The middle image, that's the Barbados Mulatto Girl, painted by Agostinho Brunias. And furthest away from me is the Warmington Gallery. In the Jubilee Gallery, as I said, they talk about the exchange of technology via the Dutch, the demographic shift away from indentured servitude to African labor, slave labor, the accumulation of material wealth by sugar planters and merchants as a result of sugar, and continuity of African cultural forms, and of course the rise of racial and class hierarchies due to plantation slavery. The Warmington Gallery is essentially an interpretation of what a wealthy planter or merchant's house would have looked like circa 1800. And it's divided into 4 segments, and essentially is chock-a-block filled with things that are related to the material culture of the wealthy. However, it's not actually interpreted with text panels or any audio-visual guides. You, the visitor, you are expected to remember what you learned in the Jubilee Gallery and apply it to that space. The Cunard Gallery is where some of the artwork of the Barbados Museum's art collection is displayed. And we've seen this image throughout the entire conference. And basically it's Governor Robinson going to church, painted in 1742. Bridgetown, that's not a very clear image, I apologize, is in the far right-hand side. Carlisle Bay is in the very background, filled with ships, trading ships, with sugar. And of course, Robinson is in the foreground with his entourage. And down here in the corner is the entire reason why all that activity is going on, enslaved Africans working in sugar cane fields. All right, the exhibitions and programmatic events, which include the story of sugar. Of course, in 2007, we commemorated the bicentenary of the ending of the transatlantic slave trade. There were other programmatic events associated with that. There was also a 2009 installation by the Barbadian artist Sonia Boyce Knight within the actual Cunard Gallery. And in that exhibition, she juxtaposes Barbadian masquerade forms on a British landscape at Harewood House, the British home of the Lascelles family. So you're going to see the Mother Sallies dancing on the landscape. So she's making the links. Ooh. Collaborations. The Slave Route Signage Project came about, and that's a collaborative effort with the Barbados Museum and the with the Ministry of Tourism. Out of that, that's where sites on the landscape are marked that are related to slavery. Out of that comes a tour, the Freedom Footprints bus tour. And most importantly, from that perspective, the proposed Slavery Museum at Newton, which is a plantation site in Barbados, but it's also one of the, let me get this right, the largest communal burial ground of enslaved people on a plantation found in this hemisphere. It was excavated by Jerome Handler back in 1969. Also very important is the UNESCO World Heritage Property. In 2012, historic Bridgetown and its garrison were made UNESCO World Heritage Sites. And let me read you that each dossier has an OUV, Outstanding Universal Value, and it says, historic Bridgetown and its garrison was the focus of the trade-based English expansion in the Americas, developed as a nexus point in the international trade of a popular tropical staple, sugar. It was able to establish its importance as a commercial port, sugar being, of course, that central theme. There is a potential future nomination. which is a serial nomination as opposed to a contiguous one. And that is on sugar sites across the island of Barbados. So for instance, Newton Slave Burial Ground, St. Nicholas Abbey, which is a 17th century plantation, as well as Codrington College. Right, issues to consider as it relates to our interpretation. The interpretation at the Barbados Museum in our core galleries is 30 years old. And essentially a huge amount of research has been produced in the past 30 years, and it's time for a redo, and we know this. And we're scheduling to start that round about 2016, tentatively, but this depends on funding, of course. There are some important stories that are omitted, such as the role of planters, African-European accommodation, gender and sugar, but is the Barbados Museum the right space to tell this? We're essentially a former military prison located on the edge of Bridgetown. And perhaps the best space to tell this is in a rural setting. Furthermore, is one site the best place to tell this, or should we not more or less tell this along with the serial nomination at several different sites, these different themes? So it's physical space as well as environmental space. In concluding, the narrative of sugar is incomplete throughout Barbados. The museum will continue to work with government as well as international agencies, but I really do think that a revolutionary approach is needed to telling the story of sugar, especially since Barbados led the world in the sugar revolution. So too, and this is me just being biased, I think that Barbados should play a revolutionary role in its interpretation. Thank you so much.
Okay, so let me thank all of you for being here at this late hour. I know that if you feel the way I feel, that your brain is full. This has been a fantastic conference. I'll add my thanks to the JCB and especially to Julie and Chris. I really want to say thank you for bringing together a group of interdisciplinary scholars. It's been so exciting to learn from people working in related but also very different fields and methodologies. Okay, so this talk is titled The Cost of Sugar, Narratives of Loss of Life and Limb. But I want to start by sharing an image with you, one that I'll also end this talk with. This image here, it's a painting by the Haitian-American artist Edouard Duval-Carrier, and this is titled Little Crippled Haiti from 2006. Carrier was actually here a couple of years ago. Tony Bogues did an exhibit of his work here at Brown and brought him here as well. I begin with this image because this talk is in part about amputation, and specifically the loss of limbs and crippling labor of sugar production, as well as the crippled bodies that are produced by sugar. In this painting, Carrier asks us to both look at and reconsider the crippled body and the long history of the exploitation of the Caribbean. There's no overt reference to sugar in the painting, but nonetheless, I think it helps us ask what kind of bodies have been produced in the Atlantic world and how we might consider producing them otherwise. And I think there's also a strong resonance here with some of the artwork that Elizabeth Parravizini-Gibert showed us yesterday, which raised questions about histories of commodity production and the creation of aesthetic value out of trash, cane trash, bagasse, refuse, and ruination. So I'm just going to leave this image up for a minute as I start my talk, and I'll return to it at the end, as I said. So we've learned in the past 2 days a great deal about the ways in which people have produced and refined sugar. But I want to begin this paper by suggesting something quite different. What if we were to reverse the syntax of this inquiry and ask not how people have produced sugar, but how sugar has produced and refined people? In posing this question in these terms, I advert to the work of Bruno Latour and his account of actor network theory, a theory in which any actor, or actant is the term that he uses, exists as a node in a network of relations with other actants. The identity and agency of the actant is produced in and through those relations. Importantly, an actant for Latour need not be a human subject, but might just as well be an object, a thing, a commodity such as sugar. In the case of the early Atlantic world, Latour's model of network theory and the redistribution of agency across persons and things therein seems particularly resonant. We might consider, for instance, that a hogshead of sugar had a greater capacity to move from one side of the Atlantic to the other than did an enslaved person living in Jamaica or Barbados. Material and discursive meaning for Latour are always generated by the relations that are enacted among the entities embedded in the network. There is no, what Latour calls transportation without deformation. There's no transportation or production of a thing that doesn't reshape the human that produces it. In short, things that touch transform one another. What then if we attend to sugar not as a commodity that is crystallized out of the juice of cane, but as one that crystallizes a set of relations around it, transforming and producing an extraordinary range of bodies and things? From saccharimeters to slave codes, from steel sugar mills to porcelain tea sets, from amputees to diabetics, from chemists to overseers, from Cimarroons to Clarissa nuns. In what follows, I want to briefly track the way that sugar as a commodity constellates bodies around it, black bodies and white bodies, partial bodies and whole bodies, or to use the words of Judith Butler, grievable and ungrievable lives. So section 1, refinement and racialization. Let's start in Barbados. Actually, we got a running start with the last paper there. In the 1640s, and this is Richard Ligon's map of Barbados, sugar was introduced as a crop in Barbados, and the need for intensive labor to cultivate sugar that ensued changed labor structures in the colony dramatically. Before the introduction of sugar cultivation, the labor force in Barbados consisted primarily of white, indentured servants. But beginning in 1650, this labor force was rapidly replaced with slaves transported from Africa. As Hilary Beckles has demonstrated, the exigencies and profits of sugar production made the reshaping of the labor force along racial lines increasingly attractive and lucrative to planters. Barbados passed its first comprehensive slave code in 1661, defining Negroes as, quote, an heathenish, brutish, and an uncertain, dangerous pride of people, end quote, over whom a new set of laws had to be extended. And this is the code again, quote, surely in anything we may extend the legislative power given us of punishatory laws for the benefit and good of this plantation, reasoned the preamble to the Barbados Act. The code insisted that African slaves could not be governed by English laws precisely because they were not English and thus not fully human. The draconian terms of this code would, in turn, serve as the basis and authority for slave laws subsequently enacted in the colonies of Jamaica and South Carolina. The demand for forced labor to fuel the production of sugar and the development of capitalism in the colonies would ultimately result in the racialization of slave labor as black and of liberty as white. In this sense, then, we might see sugar as producing race, as materially and discursively articulating a racialized distinction between free and unfree bodies. When we speak of refining sugar, then, we might also think of sugar as defining and refining the population of the early Atlantic world, with some lingering effects to be felt in our contemporary world as well. Section 2, the accident and the axe. In a verse in the midst of his 4-volume 1764 poem, The Sugar Cane, a West Indian Georgic poem on sugar cultivation, the poet James Granger mentions that accidents happen. This occurs in a passage in which he describes the feeding of sugar cane into the eager mills that will crush it to extract the cane juice. He writes, and this is the passage here, and now thy mills dance eager in the gale, feed well their eagerness, but oh beware, nor trust between the steel-cased cylinders the hand incautious, off the member snapped, thou'lt ever rue, sad spectacle of woe. Interestingly, Granger includes a footnote next to the phrase, off the member snapped. This is the footnote here. Containing some additional information about what we know to have been actually not an accident, but a fairly quotidian scene of amputation in the harvesting and processing of cane. So the footnote says, quote, this accident will sometimes happen, especially in the night, and the unfortunate wretch must fall a victim to his imprudence or sleepiness if a hatchet do not immediately strike off the entangled member, or the mill be not instantly put out of the wind, end quote. So there's a lot to be said about this passage, including its framing of agency and urgency, I'm not even going to touch what comes beneath, but again, much to be said. We might note the animation of the sugar mill and the attempt to protect it, the mill, from being put out by the unfortunate accident of a slave having a limb crushed between the cylinders of the mill and therefore having his or her arm hacked off on the spot with an axe. This latter scene is antiseptically encapsulated in the term snapped off or strike off, giving the slave a curiously inhuman status, like a plant with branches that might be snapped away without muss or fuss. The slave's limb, like the cane, is fed into the mill to be processed into sugar. I want to underscore again the non-accidental nature of such an event, one that contradicts Granger's language. Accounts of sugar production in the West Indies routinely mention the necessity of keeping a hatchet next to the mill for the purpose of amputating slaves' limbs. Here's another such passage. There's actually many of them. This is from an 1805 text by Eliza Chadwick Roberts. This is a description of the sugar mill, and I'll pick it up sort of midway through here. She says the cane is pressed. The cane has pressed the juice from it by rollers and taken out at the side. It requires care in conveying the cane into the mill for fear that the hand should be caught in the rollers, which goes with swiftness, and the whole body in a minute would be drawn into the mill. An overseer stands with a hatchet or saber ready to sever the limb in an instant in the case of accident. I was told, but such a circumstance seldom ever occurs and never without carelessness, end quote. Like Granger then, Roberts mentions that in effect, part of the mechanism of sugar production is not just a mill, but also a hatchet. So if we return to some of the idealized images of industrial sugar production, of which we've seen a number, and yesterday John Crowley, I think, gave us a wonderful reading of some of them and the absence of human bodies, we can see that not only are laboring bodies missing from these idealizations, but so too is the hatchet, an item that was equally part, I would assert, of the mechanics of the sugar mill. The production and refinement of sugar and the knowledge production that's celebrated in any image such as this one erases both the scene of labor and the literal dismemberment of bodies that's integral to the production. In this sense, we might say that sugar produces not just bagasse, but racialized bodies as waste, as expendable, disposable, ungrievable. To be sure, there is an abolitionist tradition that invokes this scene of amputation. This engraving, which again we've seen before, is from Voltaire's Candide. It depicts a scene where Candide meets a maimed slave near Suriname, and the caption reads, "It is at this price that you eat sugar in Europe." There is the tradition of blood poetry by abolitionist writers. Michelle Burnham showed us an example of that this morning, who make the equation between the blood of slaves and the sugar that's stirred into the tea at the English tea table. In the wonderful exhibition at the JCB right now, there's a section on cannibalism that takes up a lot of this material. Here, I want, in a similar vein, to ask us to think about placing these scenes of dismemberment within the network of commodity production rather than outside of it. The dismembered body is produced by sugar and by the network of material and discursive relations that crystallize around sugar. Here's my last section, sugar and neocolonialism. I'm going to take a great big leap forward into the present here. Michael Pollan, author of The Omnivore's Dilemma, argues that corn is the most effective colonizing agent in the world. Corn has thoroughly colonized the world's food supply far more aggressively than any nation of people colonized any land. What then if we look at the colonizing effects of sugar and consider how it operates not only historically but today as well? In this last section, I want to think about what kinds of bodies sugar continues to produce or to constellate around it, and the continuities between the colonial past of sugar production and the agribusiness present of sugar production. Last year, Gary Taubes and Kristen Kearns-Cousins published an article titled "Big Sugar's Sweet Little Lies" in Mother Jones magazine, in which they detailed the rather stunningly successful lobbying efforts of the sugar industry to mask the negative health effects of sugar in the American diet. A story, in the end, not terribly far from histories we're more familiar with from the tobacco industry. This is an image from their article. Taubes and Cousins write, quote, "A growing body of research suggests that sugar and its nearly chemically identical cousin, high fructose corn syrup, may very well cause diseases that kill hundreds of thousands of Americans every year, and that these chronic conditions would be far less prevalent if we significantly dialed back our consumption of added sugar." Cousins and Taubes detail in the article the enormous amount of labor and expense that the sugar industry has poured into shifting or obfuscating medical information about the effects of large amounts of sugar on bodies. These efforts have been remarkably successful in changing the regulatory climate with respect to sugar. Taubes and Cousins write, quote, "By 1973, links between sugar, diabetes, and heart disease were sufficiently troubling that Senator George McGovern convened a hearing of his Select Committee on Nutrition and Human Needs to address the issue. An international panel of experts testified that variations in sugar consumption were the best explanation for the differences in diabetes rates between populations, and that research by the USDA and others supported the notion that eating too much sugar promotes dramatic population-wide increase in the disease. One panelist suggested that anything more than 70 pounds per person per year, about half is what is sold in America today, would spark epidemics," end quote. In response to this hearing, the Sugar Association spent $700,000 between 1975 and 1980 commissioning 17 studies to exonerate sugar. So successful were these efforts that fat, rather than sugar, was taken to be the primary culprit in increased rates of diabetes in the US. Taubes, even as such research has been increasingly challenged, Taubes and Cousins conclude, quote, "It's clear enough that the industry still operates behind the scenes to make sure regulators never officially set a limit on the amount of sugar Americans can safely consume. The author of a 2010 USDA dietary guidelines, for instance, cites 2 scientific reviews as evidence that sugary drinks don't make adults fat. The first was written by a nutrition consultant whose clients include the Sugar Bureau and the World Sugar Research Organization. The second review was authored by a research manager of the Sugar Bureau," end quote. So to what extent does this contemporary history intersect with that of colonialism? Let me here juxtapose 2 images of bodies shaped by sugar. The first we've already seen from the 18th century, the second is from the 21st century. The woman in the slide on the right is a diabetic who has lost a limb to the disease. And here let me give you a few pieces of information, quantitative, regarding the differential impact of the epidemic disease of diabetes on the non-white population of the US. Diabetes is the 5th leading cause of death in African Americans, and the death rates are 27% higher than for whites. Over 2.8 million African Americans have diabetes. In addition, 25% of African Americans between the ages of 65 and 74 have diabetes, and 1 in 4 African American women over the age of 55 have been diagnosed with the disease. Diabetes is the leading cause of non-traumatic lower limb amputations in the US. More than 60% of non-traumatic lower limb amputations in America occur among people with diabetes, and African Americans are almost 3 times more likely to have a lower limb amputated due to diabetes than whites. So why is this the case? There's a tendency to blame the victim of diabetes today for failing to eat correctly, one that I would suggest echoes some language we've seen of blaming a slave for failing to feed the cane into the mill correctly. But I would argue that we should look at this side and see the effect of structural violence on both sides and not individual failing. The diabetes epidemic in the US today is in part related to the prevalence of sugar in the US diet, particularly the amount of sugar in low-cost fast food products, including soda as well as virtually every processed food, whether it's sweet or not. Diabetes is a disease of excess of blood sugar. The question as to the differential distribution of the disease and its impact in the form of amputated limbs has a great deal to do with the way in which healthcare is available or not, and to the social distribution of nutritional and food resources as well. Obesity is prevalent in poorer populations because of the way the industrial agricultural state production of food funnels high sugar, poor nutrition foodstuffs toward consumers with limited resources. In effect, then, if we look at this slide, we see a movement from the violence of compulsory sugar production to the violence of compulsory sugar consumption. This is how bodies are produced by sugar. I want to conclude, as I promised, by returning to the image of Crippled Little Haiti by Edouard Duval-Carrier. In this paper, I've suggested that we might do well to think hard about the way in which sugar creates bodies rather than vice versa. to consider the way in which sugar produces racialized bodies, crippled bodies, bodies of excess, and bodies of waste. Carrier's painting, however, asks us to reimagine that story, to rethink the human and unhuman divide, to rethink Atlantic history, ecological roots, and the aesthetic and imaginative future, as well as the line between ability and disability. He invites us to imagine the body otherwise, to consider an alternative network of relations that might give us access to other bodies and other possibilities. Thank you.
But I wanted to ask Elizabeth, and it kind of detracts from the elegance of your paper a little bit, but if you could talk about burning as an injury that's also part of the mill work, and if that figured into the materials you've been looking at.
Oh, that's interesting.
Or fire.
I haven't really, but it's interesting to think about the burning together with the cane trash, right, with the bagasse, and what that scene of burning is, and also it resonates with the image that's in the JCB exhibit of the slave who's been pushed into the boiling vat of sugar. So I haven't seen as many accounts of that. I mean, I think in the I was really struck by the number of times that I read accounts of sugar mills when there was this mention of, oh yes, and here's the hatchet, right? So the fact that that shows up again and again suggests, as I said, that it's actually part of the machinery rather than a failure of the machinery. If you come up to the front, you also get to warm up a little.
You leave us on a very potent note with this image and this last discussion. It's going to resonate with me particularly. And actually, I think back to Mince's discussion about how sugar consumption impacted working people in Europe as well. There are interesting connections. But my question actually, for Francisco, in terms of the heritage work that you've been doing, to what degree is this really geared toward an external audience of people visiting Barbados as opposed to something that's geared toward more the local audience? I'm thinking of other places where I've been where heritage discourses are really geared more toward ideas of nation and towards school children education, that sort of thing, as opposed to tourism from external visitors.
Right. It's an interesting question. Actually, when the museum was founded, it was the location, the former military prison, was picked because it's very close proximity to Carlisle Bay, and that's where cruise ships would pull up and the passengers would be rowed ashore. However, since the reinterpretation in the 1980s, there has been a reach out to communities to essentially the recognition that that is the primary constituency, while tourists would be the secondary constituency. So to answer your question, these activities, the exhibitions of the Barbados Museum and the collaborative efforts, obviously I'll get to the tourism point, that's primarily aimed at a local audience or a Barbadian audience. The interesting story, for instance, the Freedom Footprints bus tour that I mentioned, that was commissioned by the Ministry of Tourism in Barbados. The Barbados Museum researched and prepared the tour. And when it was advertised, it was specifically designed for a diasporic audience, Barbadians who live abroad. And when it was advertised, there was an overwhelming response from Barbadians, okay, to that tour. And within the past decade especially, there has been a growing desire of Barbadians to learn their history and to participate within their own heritage. There's a claiming of heritage ownership by Barbadians. I hope that answers your question.
One of the things that I remember in going to the museum was the nexus between sugar and literacy, and the claim that the Barbadians were more literate than other people in the Caribbean, in part because of missionary the Anglicans who came to teach literacy. And it was what I remembered more than the trajectory of sugar. And so I'm interested in how you see those two things coming together. They seem to be at odds.
Right, sugar and literacy in Barbados, essentially. Very good question. The general story in Barbados, and I think it repeats itself throughout the British West Indies after emancipation, is there is an attempt by the Anglican Church to create a very basic educational system. But that educational system is essentially designed to produce good laborers, okay? So I mentioned within the serial nomination, or the proposed serial nomination, Codrington College. That was willed by Christopher Codrington III in 1710 to the Society for the Propagation of Jesus Christ in Foreign Parts, the SPG. And it was supposed to be a place where medicine and religion was taught. Of course, the SPG end up owning slaves right up until emancipation, and they have a brand, an actual brand that would brand people, SPG, right? However, I mean, you know, the flip side is that there were initial attempts at education by the Anglican Church. Each of the Anglican churches have schools, and the newly freed people in 1838, you have images of adults going to these schools which are aimed for children, and they're going with their children because they're also interested in gaining knowledge and learning how to read. Other missionary groups on the island, not so much the Anglicans, but more specifically I would say the Moravians and the Methodists, make a far more real attempt at teaching people how to read. The Quakers are doing it, but they're quickly gotten rid of. More or less from the island. Life is made intolerable for them. Yes. Hope that gave
you. Okay. Oops. Sorry. I'd like to ask Jillian and Suzanne. During your presentation, I couldn't help but thinking about Lois' presentation. And it seemed to in which it appeared to me that most incentives to comply to labor were negatives, mainly surveillance and punishment. From your presentation, it seemed a more nuanced picture. I wonder if that's because it's maybe a later period, it's because you have coffee, or you have diversification, or did slaves receive other positive incentives to perform? Thank you.
I think it did depend. It was a very nuanced situation. I think it did depend on the period, on the plantation, as well as on some of the features that we talked about, which was whether people were sticking strictly with the sugar cultivation or going for a more diversified situation. Certainly at Pepin, which is one of the estates that I've had most to do with, and one of the estates that we mentioned, the owner for the period from the early 1800s up until the estate pretty much was sold in the 1850s was, as Jillian mentioned, had some peculiar ideas in terms of ameliorating the conditions on the estates that he held. He had at least 3 estates, and Pepin was the one closest to Kingston. There were 2 others on the south coast. He was not a popular figure in the Jamaican situation, and so, you know, I would say that it certainly wasn't a ubiquitous situation that people were happily seeking to ameliorate, and therefore creating conditions that would allow better material conditions for slaves. I think it did depend very much from case to case.
Yeah, I would just add to that, I think the word incentive is maybe, you know, because Wildman is an exception, that really it is the enslaved people who are taking their own right to to work their grounds and to go to market. It's illegal for them to do this. You know, they may work their grounds at night if they aren't being given extra time like wildmen. They may stay up very late to craft their ceramics or their brooms that they're selling. So it's not planters providing incentives. It's enslaved men and women saying, you know, this is an outlet, or we suggest, you know, this is a way that we can actually participate in a life beyond our enslavement here on the plantation.
Yeah, the situation of the issue of agency that people take. There's a way in which the provision grounds and the access to the market system almost create an area of relative freedom for people who have the capacity, the physical ability, or the better conditions to take advantage of it.
Hi, Professor Dillon. So what I notice in this picture, besides the amputation of the leg, is this enormous outgrowth in the head, right? So I'm wondering if you've thought about or could speak to the idea of either culturally or physical amputation as a means to estrangement in the way that we see land, right, as the actant in our relationship with nature, and whether or not either the cultural experience of amputation or the physical experience of amputation, both, you can look at it as a means of an outgrowth of ideology or a changing of the way that we sort of see nature as compared to, say, the Enlightenment and the telescope toward the field. There's an intimacy that's different here. Right?
So I definitely, I think that in that image there is an interesting ecological dimension. Also, you know, obviously a spiritual dimension with the Vodun symbols there as well. It's interesting that the human figure doesn't have a head; that it's a tree instead, which you might think of as, I mean, to be overly schematic, as reforestation, right? Or as the assertion of, as you were saying, some sort of intimacy with the land, or a re-invocation of trying to think through what that intimacy would look like. The other figure that I've thought about in relationship to this piece, but I didn't include here, is the figure of Makandal, who was lost a limb in a sugar mill, and then because of that he became a particularly skilled naturalist and learned how to poison people, and so he's one of the figures cited or credited with starting the Haitian Revolution. And the Alejo Carpentier has in his novel Kingdom of This World, he writes, he has a narrative about Makandal and Makandal's execution. And when Makandal was tied up to be burned, he was able to escape because of the stump of his arm, was able to evade the ties. And in Carpentier's novel, he then becomes I think it's a butterfly, and escapes permanently. So one of the reasons, sorry, this is kind of a long answer, but one of the reasons why I ended with this image is because I think that the challenge is to think about the transformative possibilities, and that those transformative possibilities are not, they have to do with thinking through the possibilities that emerge from a history of ruination. And I think Carrier does that kind of brilliantly there.
Well, I hope you'll join me in thanking our final panel for a very thought-provoking conclusion. Dr. Safier?
This 2.5-day event, I think, is exactly the kind of event that the JCB should be hosting. And I can say that having had absolutely nothing to do with the planning of this event, because all of this was set up in such a way that I was able to arrive and have it already basically be happening before my very eyes. But despite that, I can say that it has really been, from the beginning to end, a remarkable program that shows all of the different interconnections that can be made from a staggering array of disciplines and an extraordinary amount of preparation. And I will just would like to again have us think about the preparation that went into this by the members of the staff, and also Julie and Chris, to whom I will turn this over in just a moment. In the description of the conference, it says that, in a sense, that the purpose of this will be to evaluate or to assess, and I would nuance that a little bit, because I think what it has been to evaluate and assess the current state of scholarship. I think, in fact, what it has been an opportunity to showcase the current state of scholarship. One member of the sort of larger public said to me that it was interesting to him that none of the kind of sort of traditional names in sugar scholarship seem to have been present here. That is, people that, such as Sidney Mintz and the people whose scholarship is very familiar to anyone who works on this. But I think that has been, in many ways, what has been wonderful about these 2 days is there have not been any axes to grind about traditional debates. They have been present in some kind of shadowy form, but have really been, I think this has been an opportunity to see what creative combinations can be made when people are allowed to think outside of the traditional straitjackets of a particular discipline. So it's very difficult, I think, and this is really revelatory of the diversity of the presentations, of placing these talks into categories. It rather seems to me like something that can be thought of as a trajectory, and Elizabeth Dillon's presentation, I think, showed that in striking show-stealing kind of form, moving from Voltaire's Candide to this remarkable image of little crippled Haiti, in a way that I think gives us much food for thought. A couple of ideas that I had about the diversity and the range of what has been shown is thinking a lot about what object-centered methodologies are really about and how they can work in a lot of different ways. We have seen objects that have been elusive and have been shapeshifters, often invisible, as Diane Chris reveals in the exhibit as well, that sugar itself is a product, is an object that becomes invisible to us, but that we can, as scholars, see it emerging in a variety of different ways. We have objects such as mahogany, mules, as well as artistic forms that showcase interspecies relations that, like we saw today. These are very typical objects, I think, for anthropologists who work in a variety of present-day communities, but I think it is wonderful and very salutary that we are seeing those kinds of methodologies pushed back and highlighted in the work of historians and people who are taking historical scholarship and trying to understand how these present-day methodologies allow us to see things in new and exciting ways. Instruments is another category of objects that we've seen, from the polariscope to the saccharimeter, where technological or technical knowledge and know-how is problematized as a category, and in fact we can see different forms of knowledge revealed in very different ways and traveling in different directions at the same time. Something else that I think the papers have revealed to us is the difficulty of narrowing chronology to one particular moment. Certainly in this last presentation we saw this, but I think throughout I was pleased to see that looking at an object such as sugar forces us to confront not only the deep history of a botanical product, but also the present day history that allows us to evaluate the importance of the kind of work that we do in the first place. We also have gustatory or gastronomic forms of analysis, and from yams to the wonderful confections that we had an opportunity not only to look at, but to taste. And the idea of landscapes of sugar, whether a landscape that was coerced, surveilled, violent, as well as ecologically transformative in many ways. So ultimately, I think the best way of capturing some of the themes that have been discussed is to think about new geographies, or perhaps even a new meta-geography of the cane, a geography that can coalesce around ideas of failure just as much as it can coalesce around interconnected oceanic spaces which force us to think outside of the traditional Atlantic zone that we have been talking about. So this is a more global, a more sensorial, and ultimately a more emotional kind of history of sugar that I think, at least in my own experience, I have seen revealed in the literature. So with that, I will applaud all of you as participants and just say that it has been a wonderful start for me to be able to participate in this as an observer, and I look forward to the continuation of this conversation and turn it over to Chris and Julie.
Hi. I'll also be very brief because I know we're all anxious to get to the reception and enjoy the delights thereof. But we did want to say some quick words of thanks and make some brief closing reflections. First, thanks to the JCB, in particular to Margot Nishimura for her vision and endurance, to the staff of the... to the staff at the JCB as well, and to Neil for adopting our conference so lovingly during his first week here at the library. This is certainly the best run conference that I've ever been part of, and in fact I think it might be the best run 2.5 days of my life. So thank you to the JCB for that. Second thanks to the presenters and the panel chairs. This is the second time that I've been just overwhelmed by the response to this conference theme. The first was, when was that, back last December when we read I think it's close to 200 submissions actually that were of consistently high quality and level of interest, and selecting these papers was a difficult task. The second time that I've been overwhelmed by the response is hearing these papers over the last 2.5 days. And seeing in particular all the sort of resonances and conversations that developed between papers in ways that we never could have anticipated. There was the wonderful conversation yesterday about the saccharometer, which is fantastic, or the one this morning about livestock in Hispaniola, which was equally fantastic and surprising. In thinking about ways to kind of frame the diversity and interdisciplinarity of this conference, I keep coming back to Cristobal Silva's phrase, sugar knowledge, actually from the first panel, where he was trying to describe the difficulties that figures like Granger and Benjamin Moseley have in representing sugar, this protein commodity that transforms the world. And it strikes me that sugar knowledge is really kind of an apt umbrella term, on the one hand, for describing what many of the people described in these papers, considered in these papers, were engaged in making, conveying, resisting, relating to in some ways. From the Georgic poets that the Georgic writers that Kim Hall discussed in that first panel, to the experimental philosophers that Erica Tremba discussed in his excellent paper, to the skilled Afro-Brazilian slaves in Bardi Mandelblatt's talk, right up to the contemporary Caribbean artists in Elizabeth Pervasini-Gaber's paper on bagasse. But sugar knowledge also strikes me as an apt term for describing what all of you as scholars were in some sense engaged in producing. And one of the things that I take away from this conference is a renewed sense of just how difficult that kind of knowledge is to produce, because it's clear in these papers that to produce that knowledge, one has to confront extraordinarily difficult questions of geography, ecology, technology, identity, mobility, labor, memory, race, to just name a few of the issues that were richly addressed in these papers. So just to conclude, I've been struck by the ambition, the ingenuity, and the sheer resolve of the scholarship on display here, and it's given me a renewed sense of how important sugar knowledge is to understanding modernity. So thank you for the privilege.
So I also just want to start by thanking everybody, Margot, Neil, and the rest of the JCB staff, as well as all of you, and to offer up some of my own thoughts about some of the takeaways from this conference. Neil just mentioned, used the term metageography, which I thought was great. And I was also thinking in terms of summing up of all the images that we've seen. I mean, this has been such an image-rich conference, especially if you think about the exhibit that Diane Chris put together. So I guess in that spirit, I actually wanted to just maybe propose that we imagine an image. I'm not going to put it up because I obviously just didn't have time to do a slide or anything like that, and it's very basic. But if we think of, as Neil was saying, this sort of trajectory of sugar, I mean, I think traditional histories of sugar do imagine its history as a kind of upward trajectory, or sort of straight line. Maybe we could imagine a straight line going across the page and going upwards. But I think what happened on day one, for me at least, is that that line was really complicated. And I saw all these other kinds of lines emerging, like sort of curved, fragmented lines that were doubling back on each other and crossing in unexpected ways. So lines that tell stories not just about the rise of sugar and capitalism as a commodity that then dominated the Atlantic world, but lines that were talking more about intra-Caribbean histories of different parts of the Caribbean relating to each other across national histories and across these very traditional narratives. And of course, as we've seen in both days, also sort of global lines that go out of the Caribbean and across the world, not just across the Atlantic. Now, I think that we really have been so concerned with these global commodity chains, I mean, for good reason, obviously, but that in the process, sometimes these local ecologies and systems have been ignored. And overall, in terms of the lessons learned from day two, from today, I think, the thing that really stood out to me was the focus of so many people on the topics of environment and ecology. So here I'm especially thinking about the papers that were done by people like, James Dater and Robin Derby, where we get the sense, and also Lydia Pulsifer, where we get the sense not just of the trajectories of commodities and of sugar, but also of a kind of almost like a background to those different lines and trajectories, where, as we've learned, there were all these other agricultural and horticultural systems that have been overshadowed. I think that was Juan Justi Cordero's phrase, that have been overshadowed by the story of sugar. But I think it has become very clear from today, those other things happening in terms of what was going on in the provision grounds were by no means background activities. I mean, that really was the very ground upon which the entire sugar system was built. You know, as we heard from Bertie Mandelblatt, one of the first forms of knowledge transfer was concerning the system of provisioning. So it wasn't just, provisioning was not just a haphazard marginal activity, it really was central to the entire sugar system. So I think really what I've been taking away from today, and something that has really made me rethink day one in a new context, is this idea of thinking much more about the very grounds of the sugar system, the environment and the ecology, the specific places and their contents, and how those places evolved over time as different groups came in, as different plants came in, and as different practices evolved around those plants. I also wanted to just say it's not just about sort of different practices involving plants, but I think another theme that came out today is it was about different ways of actually conceiving of nature, place, and ecology. So here again, I'm going to go to the papers by Lauren Derby and James Dater, where I mean, I think in both of those papers, we really saw that enslaved Africans and other actors were conceiving of nature and place and looking at it in a way that really couldn't be understood by the European colonists sometimes. There's something that they had a lot of trouble understanding. It was, in some ways, there were really different understandings of nature and place at work that can't just all be assimilated into a European model. So in light of that, I mean, one of the things that I would love to see come out of the conference, because I'm hoping that conversations and work will continue after such a rich event, that I think it would be nice to see a much fuller elaboration, actually, of the whole range of views on nature, place, and ecology. And this not just for its own sake, but also to perhaps put European views of nature in their proper place, as just as local and particular as any others. So I mean, here I'm actually, I want to just mention briefly that some of you I'm sure are familiar with Dipesh Chakrabarty, the post-colonial theorist, his work Provincializing Europe. And to suggest that maybe we actually try to provincialize European views of nature and realize how peculiar actually the idea of sugar monoculture or the idea of a picturesque landscape really is. You know, I think that on day one, the very first panel with Kim Hall, Cristobal Silva, we saw in their close readings of English notions of nature in the Georgic that, you know, European notions of nature are very specific and sometimes very strange, and that they really are not universal notions of nature. And that what we have in the Caribbean really is a competition, you know, and sometimes a violent competition, sometimes more of a complementary interaction, but I think a competition of different ideas of how to use spaces and places and the things that are in them. So that, I mean, that I think, to put sugar in this broader context, to see, yes, sugar was a very important plant, but there were many other plants, and more importantly, many, many different groups of people using all these plants and giving them different meanings in the Caribbean. That, I think, for me, has really been one of the main lessons, to think about sort of the broader context of the Caribbean in terms of thinking about the story of sugar. So I don't want to keep you any longer, but I did want to again emphasize that I know that all of us have really enjoyed this conference, and we know that, you know, many people have come up to us and said how much they've enjoyed it and how much they've enjoyed meeting other people who share their interests. So I know that all kinds of conversations have been happening, and that we all, of course, have not been able to have one big conversation all the time. So we would actually love it, Chris and I and Neil, as you know, as we think about moving forward and doing maybe something else with this conference, we really invite you at the reception to come up and talk to us if you have any of your own ideas of what the big takeaways from this conference are, or other kinds of projects that you might envision in the future relating to this conference. So thank you all again for your wonderful papers and effort.